Hey there, welcome back to another video, and today I'm going to be showing you how we painted this awesome stone effect on the VINDICARE ASSASSIN model using a combination of stippling and glazing techniques. That's right, this video, there's no airbrush. This is part one of a two-part series on how to paint this model. We're going to show you how to paint the stone, the chain, and the non-metallic metal rusted effects down here. And then next week we'll show you how we can get the very cool reds on this Deadpool-esque miniature, as well as a non-metallic base that he's stood on as well. Let's get to it. This is a brilliant model that Games Workshop have produced. It's truly, truly beautiful, but I wanted to do a little bit more to it to make it my own. Simply adding some battle damage with the aid of a hobby knife to make some bullet holes, a few nicks and scratches, it just makes everything just a little bit more unique. The other thing I wanted to do though was add a way to make it look very easy for the VINDICARE model to have climbed up here. Now on the model there's like a grapnel launcher that's sculpted in, but you can't really see it. So I took some jeweler's chain, just some 1mm links, super glued that to the top part of the model and wound it around a little bit. And once that had dried, I then took that in around the rest of this area, gluing it again at the bottom. To keep the loose bit of chain link looking kind of where I wanted to, I used a cocktail stick, just a little dab of super glue, and helped tease that into place. The super glue sets between the links and keeps everything nice and solid, and that's it, model's ready for painting. We do keep this in two halves though, just to be clear. Okay, for the non-metallic metal rust, we started off with some neutral browns, we're adding some shading with some darker browns, and then we're going to start stippling. We're going to do a lot of stippling on this mini. So, if you've never done this before, you might want to check out the video above where it'll go through a lot of more of the detail on how to stipple. But to give you the broad strokes, no pun intended, take an old brush, not your best brush ever, the sharpest tip, and gently, just gently touch the model with it. Here I'm using a very old brush that's very splayed out at the tip, and you'll notice it's getting a kind of pattern on that part of the mini. I'm just using a little bit of orange mixed in with our brown colour to give me that kind of rusted look to it. And later on we'll start doing it on the statue's head as well. The point of doing this is that you're getting texture onto the miniature, or at least, and this is important, the look of texture. And things to know is not to overload your brush, otherwise you'll get a big blob of paint rather than tiny dots of paint, and not to jab the brush at the miniature, because then you'll get, if nothing else, lines rather than little dots. And remember, we're trying to create the effect of something that is much bigger than it actually is represented on your miniature, so it needs to be small to give you that micro detail. When doing the stippling on the head here, notice how we've worked more in towards the bottom of the head. Think about this as the way you would have shaded something when you were a kid. Most of us at school at some point had our art teacher make us draw a circle and then shade in the dark part of it to make it look 3D. You're basically doing the same thing here as you did there. Once we've got all this down, we'll start getting some glazes on to really refine it and bring up the effect of stone. But this early texturing is very important in getting the look that you really want by the end of it. I'm going to interrupt this video from a brief word from our sponsor, which is me. I don't know if you guys know this, but I sell both objective markers and dice with the Mohawk Miniatures branding over on my website, mohawkminiatures.com. If you'd like to pick up some of these very, very cool neoprene objective markers, as you can see marked with both 3" from the middle and 3" from the edge of the objective, as well as quite handily being perfect for use in missions that have a central objective where you may want table quarters, these are some fantastically made, very durable neoprene objective markers, very high quality, and the colors really, really do pop. You can see these from pretty much anywhere on the battlefield. At the moment, I'm running a special where you can get 20 of any dice from the various different colors that we have and a set of objective markers using the code COMBO and get 10% off your order. There's a special deal for Patreon people, which you can find in the Patreon area of Discord. So if you're a Patreon member, why don't you go and check that out for 15%. Now, let's get back to the video. Okay, we're going to start talking about the second big technique that we're using in this video, and that is glazing. Now, some of you will already be an expert at glazing, you'll know exactly what to do. Maybe you've watched that How to Thin Your Paints video that we mentioned earlier on. For those of you that are in that boat, why don't you use the time where I'm explaining to the people that haven't learned that skill yet, how to glaze, to just leave a comment down below letting everyone know some tips that you've found while you've been glazing. Or, if you're still working it out, maybe tell us about the first model you tried this technique on. If you don't know how to glaze, don't worry, I've got you covered. There's 3 things to remember. The first one is don't overload your brush. If you do and you put too much glaze on the model, you'll end up with leaving tide marks, and the whole point of glazing is to apply very, very thin layers one at a time to start creating a gradient, some sort of transition, whatever it might be on your model, but to do it smoothly. Therefore, the second thing is, if you've put too much paint on the model, you'll notice in the drying time. A glaze should really take only a couple of seconds to dry. If it takes any longer than that, you've put too much paint on your brush in the first place, you've put therefore too much paint on the model, and if you do that, you may end up tearing the top layer of paint as it dries with a wet layer still beneath. This is going to take away from any of the smooth sort of finishes that you're trying to get with the model, and therefore try to avoid doing that. The third thing to remember is that as you're glazing, glaze from the point of least impact on the model to the point of most impact on the model. So in this case, because we're painting the shadows, we're drawing our brush from the lightest part to the darkest part. The reason behind that is as you take your brush off the model, you leave a little bit of extra paint at that point. If when you're doing a shadow you end up going the other way with your brush stroke and move it into the light, when you remove your paintbrush, that little extra bit of paint there will just destroy some of the smooth transition that you've got. So make sure you always go from least impact to most impact on the model, whether it's light, shadows, different colors, whatever. That's the top 3 things I can teach you about glazing. Now you may have noticed while we've been having this chat that I've applied the same colour Steel Legion Drab to this model multiple times now. And this is because a glaze is very, very thin paint. It takes lots of layers to build up that opacity to get to where you want it to be. Each layer is ever so slightly smaller, so it gives the impression of it changing colour from one to the other by the end of our process. It does take time to apply the glazes, and it's not worth rushing it at all. It's one of those techniques that is worth putting the investment into because the end result, as I hope you can agree, is a truly magnificent thing. It's one of the most useful techniques in all of miniature painting in my book, and honestly, if you start practicing this and really put the effort into it, it will completely change your miniature painting. You'll suddenly have access to things that you didn't think you could do before. OSL, color transitions, non-metallic metal, the lot, all gets unlocked through this one technique. So definitely give it a try. Now we're starting to add in some Rhinox hide, and honestly you do need to add this in a very, very small amount at a time. If you overdo it, you'll go from very light to very dark too quickly, and while we want to have a nice dark finish to the miniature to give that really big set of contrast between the lightest and darkest areas of it, you have to work slowly. Glazes are obviously very thin by nature, but just be aware that quite often when they dry they add a little bit extra power than when they go on there wet. So don't go too far, take your time, maybe do a little test piece on the model somewhere if you feel that you need to. It's better to do that than risk ruining every part of the mini. So once your shades and your glazes are done with that, it's time to go back to some stippling. We're taking some Mellow base and highlight mixed 1-to-1, and we're just starting to bring up a little bit of texture towards the top parts of all of the mini now. Earlier on we used a Steel Legion Drab towards the bottom, where we're still going but just very, very gently. But now we're going more heavily towards the top part of the mini to really bring home that nice stone texture. And again, you can use this to help bring out any of the imperfections in your glazes, your blends, and just smooth them out a little bit. Go with some pure Menoth White highlight knife for just the top areas, and once you've done this all over all of the bright parts of the miniature, you're pretty much done with this section. By now you should have something that looks reasonably like stone, and you just need to finish tidying up some of the details for it, which we'll get to next. We've done all of the things that we need to make our stone look nice and realistic, but now what we need to do is get back some of the detail. When you're using stippling effects essentially all over a miniature, you tend to break up the surface quite a bit and make it very difficult to read the miniature. We call this readability, and what it really means is your audience, the person looking at the miniature, can see every aspect of the mini without having to really start searching around it. They can see where recesses should be, and they can see where highlights should be, and that's what we've done here. We took some Rhinoxide, thinned it down, and then applied that to all of the recesses. Then we took some Melith White highlight, which is just a little bit brighter than what we had on the rest of the model, and added that for some edge highlights. We also, during this step, started painting on a little bit of freehand cracks, some just little bits of battle damage onto the miniature. We added some earlier on physically, now it's time to add some on that's 2D, but we will be making it look 3D pretty soon. The keys to this are making sure that it looks at least reasonably random, and one of the best ways to do that is to use a very fine point on your brush. You can still use a number 1 brush like I'm using here, just make sure that it's got just a little bit of paint on and comes nicely to that tip, and try and make the cracks look like they belong in the areas they are. So for instance here you can see we're putting them on the sort of upper left part of her chest, but that's because that's where there's a big break in the outside of the mini. You could put them in other random places, but at least next to something that looks like it's broken is a good place to go because it looks like it belongs there. And telling a narrative while you're painting a miniature with your battle damage, I think is really important. It's time to get that really awesome looking greenish hue to our stone, and for this we're going to need to use some Eldritch from P3. Now we're going to thin this to past a glaze. Now we've talked a lot about glazing and making sure your consistency is right, and you might have watched the video we mentioned earlier on to make sure your consistency is right. But what happens if you make it too thin? And this is what we actually need to use for this right here. So if we look at the palette itself, you can see we've got some Eldritch and some water, and all you ever need for stuff like this is water. If you thin that down to a glaze, here's how it behaves on the palette. You've got something that's got decent coverage when applied to something like my thumbnail, which I always use to test glazes to make sure they're right consistency. But if we take just the brush and then add a load more water to what was just left on the brush, what we've got is a solution that's super thin. Now you normally don't want to paint with something quite this thin. It doesn't have the same sort of texture as paint once it's glazed and then dried on the miniature. It can end up looking very chalky, and the reason for this is there's almost no medium left in the paint anymore. You've got this tiny amount of medium, you've got a little bit of pigment, hence why there's still colour in our mix, but almost all of it is water. At this stage, when the paint dries, the pigment is suspended usually towards the top of the water, and as evaporation occurs, it shrinks the bubble of water, bringing the paint into the middle. Then you end up with more of it in the middle of your dry paint than in a nice even layer across a surface, which is what you'd usually want with a glaze. Because of this, it makes it very useful for doing stuff like this stone. What we want is this little sort of collection of extra pigment to be in the places where our recesses are, and to just tint the model a little bit rather than give it a nice even surface finish like a glaze. Now you still have to be careful when you're applying it. You can't just shellac it on and hope for the best, because you'll still get tide marks and things like that happening if you put too much paint on the miniature. But it's a very forgiving thing to be able to use. So what you can do is just add a little bit to your brush, fill recesses on the model with it, and as it dries, it will dry with a slight gradient aiming into the deepest part of the recess, because that's the way that the pigment settles in the paint as it dries. Because of this, we've ended up with this really awesome greenish hue to our stone that's given us something that just stands out that little bit more. It adds that little extra bit of colour, that bit of vibrancy, and just changes it ever so nicely to give you something that will really make your models stand out from the competition. This is a great technique for use for things like rust and weathering and dirty water and stuff like that, as well as dust effects and things on the boots of your miniatures as they've been walking through a desert or similar environment. You should really try this out next time you're doing something like that. Maybe instead of using powders, you could give this a go and see how you fare with it. Now, for some reason I decided to punish myself by painting the chain in a non-metallic way. After all, we've done everything else on the Mini in this kind of fashion, so why not? With a base coat of Eshin Grey and then some dark tone liberally applied over the top of it, we were pretty much ready to start the highlights. And notice I did this section before painting all of the glades and shades that we've just done on the rest of this arc. Just adding in a little Morrow White at a time, and we did this many times, probably like 5 or 6 different coats of paint with just a little bit more white every single time, focusing our highlights to where the light would hit on the chain. Now I want you to kind of think of this less as highlighting every single individual chain link and more highlighting where the light would hit it as a whole. So you'll notice towards the top of the chain there's a lot more light. As we get around one of those big spikes there's a little bit more light. These are the sort of things to do. A good comparison, which sounds weird, is to think about those like shampoo adverts and things like that where you've got somebody with really shiny wavy hair and you're getting bands of highlights across the hair rather than individual strands being highlighted. Then with some Thamar Black we simply just added in some shadows and we were kind of done with that. I used the same Thamar Black to freehand a unicorn because after all this is Deadpool and he kind of needs to have a unicorn somewhere, so a little bit of back and forth with some of our bone colours and the black gave us exactly what we needed. Now like I said, next week there'll be a video on how to paint Deadpool himself as well as the non-metallic metal superstructure that he is stood on. I hope you've all enjoyed this video and you are going to have a go at painting a model like this as well. I really liked this mini. I had a great time painting it as well as producing the video. If you like it, leave a comment saying why you like it, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to see next week's video. We'll see you guys in the streams. Peace out.